you reported wars for 20 years, and are an ordained minister. I was wondering, Chris, where do you place God? You've seen so many wrongdoings, so many killings, children being shot, families being torn apart, all those brutal murders and wars, and still you are a minister. How do you explain it to yourself, and where is God in the whole story?
Right. Well, we live in a morally neutral universe, without question. And some people said, well, 45 foreign reporters were killed in Sarajevo. um, and people said, well, you survived for a reason. And I said, no, that's just obscene to say that when 2,000 children died in that city. So are you telling me that my life was somehow more important or more precious in the eyes of some divine being than a child? Um, I once asked Daniel Berrigan, the great radical priest who baptized my youngest daughter, how he defined faith, and he said the belief that the good draws to it the good. Even if empirically everything around you says otherwise, and the Buddhists call it karma, but in the Christian religion we don't know where it goes. But I believe that's right. I believe the good does draw to it the good. Some sociologists and psychologists call these phantoms, these figures, moral figures that you carry with you, including like my father, who no longer are living, but you carry that. I think morality can't be taught. I think it can only be shown. And so, I cover the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. But when
Mhm.
I was in Prague, I was in Wenceslas Squares, 500,000 Czechs. It was December, snowing, and this Czech singer, Marta Kubasheva, came out on the balcony. Now, she had been the most popular, certainly one of the most popular singers pre-1968 in Czechoslovakia, and then when the Soviets invaded in '68, she sang this anthem of defiance called A Prayer for Marta. And when Dubček was overthrown and the pro-Soviet regime was installed, her recording stock was destroyed, she was banned from the airwaves, and she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line at a toy factory. And she came out and began to sing A Prayer for Marta, and every Czech in the crowd knew every word. Most of that crowd had been born after '68. So there's a kind of example of how the good draws to it the good. Um, and uh, and I think that's a pretty good definition for me of what faith is. You don't carry out everything I fought for in my lifetime, going all the way back to the wars in Central America, on every single aspect is worse. But I don't think that invalidates what I've done.
I was just wondering how, when you see a mass grave and you see children killed, do you ever wonder where is God? How do you process such events for yourself? Do you look at it just from a journalistic perspective? Do you separate it, or
Well, at the moment, yeah, you have to. So when you're dealing with that as a journalist, you're numb. You may have an emotional reaction later, but you're attempting to gather information to write a story, even if the bodies are lying at your feet. So yeah, you don't, if you, there is a kind of clinical quality to that kind of work, which doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you later, but in the moment, you can't do your work if it does. There were moments, of course, when it was affected. So how do you process it? Um, Well, because I understand, let's go back to that notion of radical evil. How radical evil is real, and those who stand up to face radical evil usually accept their own self-sacrifice. Their own demise, and that often is the case. Whether it's Oscar Romero in El Salvador, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. That persistent fight against radical evil often costs you your own life. But within that circle of evil, there is always this light, this goodness. So, for instance, when a shell, I was in Sarajevo, was being hit with about 300 shells a day. There was no water system, so people had to gather around collective water taps, and the Serb gunners knew where they were, and they'd wait until people congregated to get the water, and they'd
Mhm.
drop these heavy shells, 155 howitzers or the Soviet equivalent, and 90 millimeter tank rounds. I mean, really big stuff. And it would just blow people to smithereens. I mean, just eviscerate people. And you could feel palpably these rings of kind of death emanating out from this horrible atrocity. And yet at the same time, loved ones, families, friends would push forward to try and find people who were wounded and that they could save. And it was this kind of alternating wave. I mean, you could feel it of life and death, of, let's call it good and evil. And I was a prisoner in Basra. I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard after the first Gulf War, and eventually turned over to the secret police, and it was very brutal and unpleasant, and I didn't know if they were going to kill me. And it was the roofs and back. I was in Basra, but then I was eventually transferred by the Republican Guard to Baghdad and turned over to the secret police, Muhabarat. And I hadn't eaten for 24 hours or had water or anything. And the roofs in Baghdad are flat. And in the morning, the women and children would get up on the roofs and bake bread. And I speak Arabic, and I yelled out that I was an American. We just bombed their country. And I was a journalist, and I hadn't eaten it. And the mothers gave the children this bread to scamper across the roofs to give me. So when I think back on being held in that room by the police, and I was roughed up and everything else, I invariably think of that memory. I don't know whether it's psychological exit or defense or whatever, but it was the power of that, of solidarity and of compassion, and overrides, at least for me, the psychological trauma that I endured in that cell. So, good and evil are real. It's an eternal battle. It'll never end. And but is there a divine being or a great watchmaker? I don't know. I don't come out of that. I've seen too much of how the world works.
Yeah. Well, I think they gave you the bread listening to your story because you speak Arabic and you respect their culture by speaking Arabic. Which American speaks Arabic, especially GIs in Iraq? They don't speak Arabic. They don't show that kind of respect. So if you speak Arabic, of course, you gain respect very quickly, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's true everywhere. I mean, that's why I worked so hard to learn the languages
Yeah.
of whatever conflict I was in. Yeah. So it's just common courtesy. No, they didn't speak. The occupation forces spoke one language. That was the language of violence. That's it. They didn't no other way to communicate. And they weren't interested in any other way of communicating.
What language did you speak in Bosnia?
I did not speak Serbo-Croatian but that wasn't my fault. I was in Cairo, and I was supposed to go in the fall, and I had a Serbo-Croat tutor in Cairo so that I could learn it. And then the ceasefire broke down in May, and the correspondent who was there did not want to go back in, kind of understandable. It was incredibly dangerous, and I had 2 days to get on a plane. And when you're writing, 6, 7 stories a week, you don't have any time. So that was the one conflict I covered where I did not speak the language, and it hurt me. You're separated from the culture. I mean, I worked for the New York Times, so there was no shortage of translators and
Mhm.
all sorts of people to assist me, but it's not the same.
It's not the same, and I'm sure the quality and the depth of your articles is very different from the ones you've
Yeah,
written
that's true.
speaking Arabic. Yeah, but of course the Bosnia war didn't last for 20 years like the Iraq war did, so you didn't have that much time to prepare and learn the language.
Well, I learned Arabic before. I learned Arabic because I was in the Middle East in '88, so I learned Arabic before either the first
Yeah,
or the second Gulf War.
yeah. Yeah.
I learned Arabic because I was going to be stationed in the Middle East.
Yeah, for the New York Times as a.
Well, I was originally there for the Dallas Morning News, and then I was hired by the New York Times.
Yeah.